Well, hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Reading Michael Jackson. I am your host, Lena, and I'm so happy to be back here with you again this week to continue our reading of Dancing the Dream. Last week's episode was pretty heavy and also pretty long, and so I do want to keep this one this week a bit shorter to kind of balance us out a little bit. The last few weeks I've gotten pretty enthusiastic during the conversations, and of course that has led to longer episodes. But I want this to be consumable in your average American commute time. And for those international fans, hopefully just consumable at any time. With that said, I just want to add, I had the recent experience of attending a showing of The Wiz. I don't know if this was only in the United States or if this was international, but very briefly in mid-May, The Wiz was released back into theaters. Just for a few days. I know it was on a Sunday, was the majority of the fans and people I saw going. But it was a wonderful, wonderful experience to attend the showing of The Wiz, to see Michael in his actor, movie star kind of role. Michael is so impressive in this film. And the one thing I have always taken from every viewing of this film is his incredible earnestness as an actor, his total ability to immerse himself into the role and become that person, or in this case, that scarecrow. And it was cute for me too, because of course I've seen The Wiz a few times since becoming a Michael Jackson superfan. But the first time I ever saw The Wiz, I was in 5th grade, which in America is, you're about maybe 10 years old in 5th grade. And I had moved to a new school district, and my music teacher showed us The Wiz in a music class. And I remember her saying it stars Diana Ross and Michael Jackson. And I was like, okay. And I just remember seeing this movie and falling in love with the Scarecrow. I mean, I just thought he was adorable and so cute, and I just loved him so much. And I remember going home and singing Ease On Down the Road all around my family's house and talking endlessly about The Wiz for like 2 days. I don't know if my family would remember this, but I was so excited, and I just kept singing Ease On Down the Road, and I couldn't wait to see the Scarecrow again. And I knew it was Michael Jackson, but that didn't mean anything to me at that point, because I wasn't a fan as a little kid or anything. So it's kind of funny, as I eventually saw it again and I remembered that it's sort of hilarious that the universe was telling me at a very early age, you will love this man someday. And I do, and I always will. Anyway, if you weren't able to go see it in theater, I highly recommend watching it again. It's just a really good time and really sweet. With that said, I do want to make this a shorter episode, so let's see what happens with that effort in mind. So join me for this reading, get comfy, get cozy, and listen to the 25th piece from Dancing the Dream called The Elusive Shadow. The Elusive Shadow. Even though I traveled far, the door to my soul stayed ajar. In the agony of mortal fear, your music I did not hear. Through twisting roads in memory lane, I bore my cross in pain. It was a journey of madness, of anguish born in sadness. I wandered high and low, recoiled from every blow, looking for that stolen nectar in my heart, that long lost scepter. In all those haunted faces, I searched for my oasis. In a way, it was in a drunken craze, a cruel hysteria, a blurry haze. Many a time I tried to break the shadow following me I could not shake. Many a time in the noisy crowd, in the hustle and bustle of the din so loud, I peered behind to see its trace. I could not lose it in any place. It was only when I broke all ties, after the stillness of the shrieking cries, in the depths of those heaving sighs, the imagined sorrow of 1,000 lies, I suddenly stared in your fiery eyes. All at once I found my goal. The elusive shadow was my soul. Okay, so I'll be honest, my first response to this piece is, wow. Wow, there's a lot here. There's a lot to analyze and interpret. I actually did something I almost never do. I paused my recording and I read it again and I took some notes. I didn't want to go into my analysis too quickly. I wanted to sit with it a bit longer. The Elusive Shadow. This is one of those pieces that leaves a lot of room for questions, but also offers some specific answers, namely in the final line, where this entire time we might be thinking, okay, what is this elusive shadow? And by the end, we do have an answer. Now, I don't want to jump right to that. I'd like to talk a little bit about this piece as we break it down. First of all, because I find this piece pretty complicated, actually, I'd like to go through each verse one at a time. So starting at the first verse. Even though I traveled far, the door to my soul stayed ajar. In the agony of mortal fear, your music I did not hear. Through twisting roads in memory lane, I bore my cross in pain. Now, looking at that first verse, there's a few things I'd like to point out. When he says, though I traveled far, the door to my soul stayed ajar. To me, that sounds like someone who is vulnerable. Not necessarily open, but vulnerable. The difference I mean by that is a person who is open-hearted or, open to the world is not necessarily living in a place of fear. But a person who is vulnerable might be a person who is, they're letting their guard down in a way that could leave them open to vulnerabilities or open to harm in some way. That's how I interpret that line. Because it's directly followed by the line, in the agony of mortal fear. Mortal fear. The word mortal to me sticks out. Your music I did not hear. Instantly, for me, the combination of your mortal fear and your music I did not hear, I think this is about God. This is Michael's revelation or exploration of his own struggle to feel or see God. That's how I read it. So maybe he traveled far from God, but he still felt open to God, left that door to his soul ajar. Or he traveled far because the circumstances of his life brought him far, far away from normalcy, far away from people he knew and trusted, but left him vulnerable because he needed more. So you can read it in a couple of different ways, right? But I certainly find it interesting to read this first verse about God. Your music I did not hear. I find that interesting. Someone waiting to hear music. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, actually, in the episode How I Make Music, talking about God's gifting Michael music. Well, if you stop hearing music, that's a gift you typically receive from God, and you stop hearing it, that would make you feel quite distant from God, very confused or perhaps abandoned by God, right? So that's how I'm interpreting that first stanza. He says, through twisting roads in memory lane, I bore my cross in pain. And the cross in pain also strikes me as being about God in two different ways, right? So the first way I read it about God is Michael as a believer bearing his cross, wearing a cross while feeling a sense of disconnect or a sense of abandonment or pain. But I also thought about the allusion to Jesus here. We're carrying a cross, a kind of sacrifice, a sense of, being sacrificed in some way. I see both as possible interpretations, but again, there's a lot there in the first verse, right? Lots of ways to interpret this. He says it was a journey of madness, of anguish born in sadness. And so again, if we think about this as a crisis of faith, an anguish born from sadness, the level of sadness he experienced made him question his own faith, made him question the presence of God in his life, perhaps. I wandered high and low, recoiled from every blow. I interpreted that a couple of ways. So a life without faith gave him less to ground himself in when challenging things happen. He had to recoil from every blow. So he didn't, stand strong in the face of challenges, but he recoiled. He withdrew himself. I see that as kind of a sense of loneliness or self-abandonment in some way. He ends this verse, in all those haunted faces, I searched for my oasis. And that part really struck me the most because up until this point, we're talking about his own kind of challenge to feel or see or hear this presence of God. But here we see he's surrounded by people with haunted faces, whether that is the people directly surrounding him that he knew in life, strangers that he was surrounded with. I searched for my oasis, searching for love and comfort, searching for a solution in other people, perhaps in the wrong people, in people who are haunted, perhaps simply looking in the wrong places. So at this point, I started to think about this poem. Is this about God? Is this about faith? Is this about self-confidence? Is it the presence of self-doubt? Of this thing that's chasing him, causing him such anguish, that is making him seek comfort and love in the wrong places. It could be about a lot of things. The mortal fear, is that a nod to God, like we're mortal in comparison to his immortality? Or is it the mortal fear we all have of what our existence means and what our purpose is and why we're here? So a couple of different ways to interpret this, I think. He goes on to the next verse to say that there's this shadow he could not shake no matter how hard he tries. He can't outrun it. He can't escape it. I peered behind to see its trace. I could not lose it at any place. So the inevitability of this lingering presence for him that he could not avoid, that he tried to deny. So again, this could be about God, fleeing away from your faith, fleeing and separating from God. But it could also be about a sense of destiny, running away from destiny, running away from what is meant for him, afraid to pursue what is meant for him. And I say that in part because of how we arrive toward this ending here. It was only when I broke all ties, after the stillness of the shrieking cries, and the depths of those heavy sighs, the imagined sorrow of 1,000 lies, I suddenly stared in your fiery eyes. All at once I found my goal, the elusive shadow was my soul. So this part really interests me, right? This whole final verse interests me. When he says, when I broke all ties, I immediately thought of his ending his connection with the Jehovah's Witnesses and leaving that faith community. And we talked about this actually in the God episode a few weeks back, where we talked about how perhaps for Michael, a separation from religion actually led to him having a stronger faith. And I think that's kind of alluded to here, where he broke all ties only then, after the stillness of the shrieking cries, the depths of the heavy sighs, imagined sorrow of 1,000 lies. I mean, all of that makes me think a crisis of not necessarily a faith in God, but a faith in the religion, and perhaps distancing himself, seeing things that he no longer believed in, disappointing people, having to disappoint his family, his community. That would have been very difficult for him, I imagine. I also could read this, though, as not necessarily about religion, but about critics, breaking ties from needing, full approval from the world, of needing a certain kind of esteem, dealing with the negative press, the negative voices around him. I can see it really going both ways. But then he ends, all at once I found my goal. The elusive shadow was my soul. And that part, it throws me, but it also puts it all in perspective too. Because if the entire piece is actually being directed toward himself, there's this idea that then his soul was not always present in him. So it makes me think, okay, we have our soul, but we also have our personality, we have our human ego. So what was leading him before? He could not escape his soul. He could not deny his soul. He could not exist without it, but he spent this time running away from it, this time trying to push it away. And only then, kind of finding some clarity as he made some choices in his life, finding some clarity to affirm that, yes, that is following the direction of his soul, following his own heart, listening to the voice inside of himself. That was the right choice. This elusive thing he could not escape, that followed him, that he tried to block out. I almost think of it as a person who knows what's right for them, but doesn't trust themselves for any number of reasons, doesn't trust. And so they question themselves and they push away their own truth because they are hearing all these other voices and influences that are making them doubt themselves. And so finally, when we are all one, finally, when we have an inner peace about this, we can kind of come back together and realize that you can trust yourself. And the inner voice was the depth of who you are, your soul. It actually reminds me of this concept I've talked about in therapy, where there's this many of us have that part of ourselves that kind of know what is right and has a sense of wisdom and certainty about what is true. And then there's this part of us that carries the fear and the primary driving motivation is to avoid pain. But the ideal is for us to find a middle ground so that we can kind of achieve this wise mind where we can see a situation clearly and make the right choices for ourselves. Now, I don't know. I look back at this whole piece, and like I said, I think there's multiple interpretations. I am the most comfortable knowing Michael in the way that I do, knowing Michael and his interests and the things he's written about so far. I think it makes sense that this is about a crisis of faith and recovering that sense of faith. And I would suggest that this theory is supported by the artwork that accompanies this piece. So we have a drawing placed on the opposite side of the page that is a drawing of an adorable little boy with curly hair. And he is running. And instead of his shadow behind him, like a shadow normally is, his shadow is out front, and the shadow is not in the form of his body, but in the form of an angel, where it has wings and it's hovering over him. And I see this as the perfect illustration that depicts this idea that it's about Michael realigning for whatever it was, whether it was a crisis of faith or a crisis of his life, of the things he was experiencing. He had an inner distance from himself, where the needs and priorities of his soul were not being met because of the focus on other things, because of the focus on trying to find an oasis in someone else or something else or someone's face. Perhaps trying to find an oasis, like this dream, peace, and comfort and beauty in the faces of a crowd. Haunted faces, faces of a crowd that he doesn't know, or even people he knew that were haunted that he tried to find his way in. We don't know, about all of Michael's personal relationships and the many mistakes he may have made with trusting the wrong people. I mean, even just thinking about, my own life and the lives of those I know and love, how many of us haven't made the error of trusting the wrong person with our heart or seeking what we needed in the wrong places? So I see this whole poem about Michael realigning and sharing that journey of pain and sorrow and anguish, as he said, to a point of freedom and self-acceptance and an alignment within his core self. Earlier this year, I was kind of having my own personal struggle, and I decided I needed a reminder every day that the things that I do each day should sit right with my spirit and should sit right with my soul and who I know I am on a higher level, like a higher plane of existence. So who I am absent from human ego. So I bought this little ring on Etsy. It's this ring where you can add any word you want to it. And I had it write the word spirit. And so every day I wear this little ring that says the word spirit on it. And I did this because I wanted the reminder every day to look down at my hands and to see that I want the life I live to align with that wise mind, that spiritual part of myself that does know more, that is my guiding light, my own guiding light. And that's what the Elusive Shadow reminds me of. And that's why I like that as much as I see this poem as being about God and a crisis of faith, I actually see it also about a recognition of self and worthiness and knowing what's best and following and trusting your voice. When he says, all at once I found my goal, that makes me think too, not just a goal for music and what that meant for him, but a goal is in his purpose for being alive. Like there's things we do every day that give us a sense of driving purpose, but I think most of us, there's a deeper meaning behind it. Like, why do you go to work every day? Well, probably to support yourself, but to also take care of your children or your parents or, your loved ones, whoever. There's a sense of love and service behind almost everything you can do in that way. So what is the driving purpose? So Michael maybe made music, but his driving purpose of what he hoped to achieve went far beyond just making music. He wanted to, as he said many times, to unite the world, to bring people peace, to make people happy, to spread the message of love and unity, to use his wealth and fame and notoriety to improve people's lives. This was his purpose. So I read this with all this in mind, and I think this man perhaps experienced a crisis of faith, an absence of God in his life, perhaps a crisis of himself. Maybe he has all this success and he looks around and wonders why and what to do with it. And maybe one day he had this realignment and everything started to click and make sense. And what I find really interesting is to think that in the early 90s, that is when Michael established the Heal the World Foundation, right around the time that this book was published. So perhaps that's what we're talking about here, right? He went through a crisis and a faith or whatever, and on the opposite end, realigned and discovered what he was really meant for. And that's how it all came together. And that's how we have a man with the legacy he has today. So this was a bit of an interesting episode for me because normally I identify some themes and I run with them. And this whole one, I felt like I was analyzing. So whether you agree with my analysis or not, that is perfectly fine. I would love to know your opinions on this piece. And if you want to leave comments, if you listen on Spotify, that would be really cool. If you want to leave comments on YouTube, that would be really cool. Most of all, though, I just would love to hear from anyone who is interested in this. So if you are on social media, I strongly encourage you to visit the Michael Jackson Book Club on Facebook. I am on there. I frequently share about the podcast, and I would love to get to know you and your own thoughts about Michael. I don't have much of a presence online otherwise. So needless to say, I'd love to hear your thoughts about Michael, about the podcast, or this episode in particular, whatever you like. But I want to thank you so much for once again taking time from your life, from your very busy day, to sit with me, to discuss, to read, to try your best to understand not only the man who wrote these pieces, but the ideas he was sharing with all of us to consider. So thank you. I look forward to talking with you all again next week. In the meantime, take care.